Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, Volume 1, Crusades prior to the rise of the Ayyubid state. Start of Part 1 of Chapter 2. The most important causes of the Crusader invasion. During this period, Western European society was dominated by local conflicts and wars between feudal princes, which helped to exacerbate the worsening social and economic situation in Western Europe. The conflicts between the two heads of the Western Christian world at that time, the Pope and the Emperor, also had a great effect on the course of European events. The papacy had reached a high level of power and influence during this period, which had opened the door to it becoming an international power in the sense that the Pope was officially the spiritual leader of all Christians in the East and in the West equally. However, there were ongoing conflicts between the two churches, the Eastern Orthodox and the Western Catholic, each of which insisted that its point of view should prevail and it should have the upper hand over the other. Hence, when the idea of a crusade was suggested to Pope Urban II from 471 to 491 Hijri, that is 1078 to 1097 Common Era, he saw it as a great opportunity to put an end to the dispute between the two churches and to dominate the Eastern Orthodox Church and incorporate it into the Western Church under his leadership. On the basis that this would all be done under the cover of fighting the Muslims, protecting the Byzantines and taking back the Holy Lands in Palestine. This was in addition to many other aims that the papacy wanted to achieve through carrying out a holy war, such as putting an end to the power and influence of the feudal lords in the West, and at the same time putting an end to ongoing feudal wars by diverting those energies and exploiting them in a conceited holy war that might create opportunities for petty rulers to enjoy a better life in the East without disputes. Opinions differ as to the nature of the Crusader movement and its hidden motives. Some think that the motive was materialistic. Others think that it was the offspring of the zealotry and religious fanaticism that were common in Europe during the Middle Ages, and that the true motive behind these wars was in fact religious fervor mixed with other aims, such as the desire to establish new kingdoms and acquire great wealth. The majority of historians, both classical and contemporary, regard these wars as religious wars and believe that the religious factor was the primary motive behind them, with the aim of taking back the supposed sepulchre of Christ and the Holy Lands from the Muslims. Others regard that as one of the manifestations of economic and colonialist expansion in the Middle Ages. In fact, the Crusades were the result of the interaction of all these factors, because they were undertaken for political, economic, and social reasons, and used religion both as fuel and as a means of concealing the motives mentioned. It is impossible to underestimate the religious factor in these wars in any way. There follows a detailed discussion of the motives and causes. Religious motives. The religious motive was the primary motive that drove the Crusader masses into battle. The symbol of the Crusades, which demonstrates the importance of the religious aspect, was the cross which they put on their weapons and luggage when they headed for Palestine in particular. A religious revival movement had appeared in Western Europe in the 10th century and reached its peak in the 11th century, strengthening the position of the papacy and stirring up religious fervor in the people's hearts. The Church exploited this fervor, finding an external outlet for it. When the idea of a crusade emerged, the churches took Western Europe as a vast arena in which to exploit this suppressed energy and raging fervor. This was done in the name of saving Jerusalem from the infidel Muslims. The most famous of those who adopted the call for a crusade was Pope Urban II, who is regarded as being primarily responsible for propagating the war against the Muslims and inciting the first campaign against Greater Syria. Circumstances were ripe, so he hastened to hold a meeting in the city of Clermont in France. The meeting lasted for 10 days and was attended by more than 300 churchmen, as well as princes from different parts of Europe, envoys of the Byzantine emperor, and representatives of the Italian city-states. The Pope was able to stir up the fervor of his audience, and the cry reverberated through all sectors of society. Deus vult, God wills it. Those present hastened to take the cross as a symbol. The Pope also pointed out what he called the Islamic danger that was threatening Europe from the direction of Constantinople. He declared that the Christians in the East were suffering from Muslim oppression, and that churches and monasteries had been destroyed. He urged his listeners to take revenge on the Muslims. In fact, what the Pope said about the Eastern Christians being persecuted were false claims. Such persecution is not in accordance with the spirit of Islam, or the nature of its message and the care that it shows to Christians. One of the slogans of this war was that the Christian pilgrims had been subjected to persecution and aggression en route to Jerusalem, just before the Crusades began. This was also a false claim. A prominent European historian says that isolated cases of persecution to which Christians were exposed in Muslim lands, especially in the Near East, cannot be taken as a valid reason for the Crusader movement under any circumstances, because Christians in general enjoyed a good share of religious and other freedoms under Muslim rule. Not only were they allowed to keep their old churches, they were also allowed to build new churches and monasteries, in the libraries of which they collected theological works of all sorts. The claims of churches and monasteries being destroyed or confiscated were not based on any evidence. They were just rumors, a fact which highlights the role of false propaganda in opening up this front against the Muslims. A particular incident in a particular village may have played some propaganda role, but that cannot be taken as the norm of Muslim interactions with Christians and their churches in Muslim lands. More than one fair-minded historian has confirmed that the Christians who were subjected to Seljuk rule were much better off than their brethren who lived in the heart of the Byzantine Empire itself. There is no evidence that the Seljuks persecuted the Christians in the East. Nevertheless, the Pope's calls reached a fever pitch of hatred, with no rational thought about negative consequences of his imprudent call. Otherwise, what did it mean when he said to his followers, "Go and annoy the barbarians, rid the Holy Land of the infidels, and take possession of it for yourself, for as the Bible says, it is flowing with milk and honey"? The Pope promised the masses who took part in the war that the sinners among them would be spared punishment, and they would be exempted from taxes. He also promised that the Church would look after their families in their absence. Perhaps another factor that may be included under the heading of religious motives is the fact that the news of miracles and wonders propagated by the Church had become widespread in the West. There was a prevalent belief that the second coming of Christ was imminent, and it was essential to persist in seeking forgiveness for sins and doing good deeds before he arrived. There was also a notion that the Holy Land should be regained before the return of Christ. The Pope realized that this intense religious fervor would not last for long, so he called for vows and prayers to be offered in the Church of the Resurrection, and he announced that the curse, the sword of vengeance, would come upon everyone who was seized by cowardice and weakness or who turned back on his heels. The Pope threatened to excommunicate everyone who did not respond to the Church's call to head towards the Muslim lands. He shrewdly exploited emotions and feelings to achieve his plans. The Church was influential because of the power that it had over people's hearts in Western Europe at that time, which made his call to arms successful, with the result that people came out in crowds, heading in a wave of successive Crusader campaigns toward the Islamic East. We should not forget the hatred that the Crusaders had towards Islam and the Muslims, because Islam has taken from them lands that had been under their control and liberated slaves who had been suffering under their domination. It took away possessions that had been in their grasp, hence grudges started to smolder in their hearts, and the fires of enmity flared up, and they began to seek opportunities to regain what they had lost, and avenge themselves against those who had brought them low and torn apart their kingdom. The famous Orientalist Prince Leon Saitani, who gave most of his wealth to write the history of the Islamic conquest movement in his book Anali Delv Islam, explains to us the reason for this hatred of Islam and Muslims in the introduction to his book, where he says that he only wanted to understand through his work the extent of the Islamic catastrophe that took away from Christianity millions of followers all over the world who still follow the religion of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and believe in him as a messenger. Allah, may he be the exalted, says, "Never will the Jews nor the Christians be pleased with you, O Muhammad, till you follow their religion. Say, verily, the guidance of Allah, that is the only guidance. And if you were to follow their desires after what you have received of knowledge, then you would have against Allah neither any protector or guardian, nor any helper." Quran, chapter 2, verse 120. And they will never cease fighting you until they turn you back from your religion, if they can. And whosoever of you turns back from his religion and dies as a disbeliever, then his deeds will be lost in this life and in the hereafter, and they will be the dwellers of the fire. They will abide therein forever. Quran, chapter 2, verse 217. Political motives. The kings and princes who participated in the Crusader movement were striving for political aims which they could not hide, either before their arrival in Syria and Palestine, or after they settled in those lands. The feudal system was inherently connected to land, and the bigger the fiefdom and the larger the amount of land, the higher a prince's status in society rose. Under this system, the biggest problem faced by princes and knights was not having any fiefdom or land, for they were then regarded as unimportant and having no influence. Many knights and princes were left without land, because one of the basic principles of this system was the law of primogeniture, in which only the oldest son inherited the fiefdom. When the owner of a fiefdom died, the land passed in its entirety to his oldest son. This meant that the other sons were left without any land, which was a loathsome situation in a feudal society. This led landless knights and princes to seek ways of overcoming this obstacle, by finding an heiress to marry, or by means of aggression and war aimed at acquiring land. The Crusader movement opened a new door to this group of princes and knights. They answered the Pope's call and hastened to take part in this movement, in the hope that they would succeed in establishing principalities for themselves in the East, to compensate for what they lacked in the West. As for the knights and princes who owned fiefdoms, they found that taking part in the Crusader movement gave them a good opportunity to attain higher glory and greater status. In our study of sources on the Crusades, we saw that the ambitions of the princes in the first campaign were manifested in many political ways. They started to divide the booty when they were still on their way, before they had actually acquired the booty. We shall see, by Allah's leave, how conflict between them occurred outside Antioch, because each one of them wanted to seize it. How those who managed to make some gains for themselves on the road were content with that, and gave up participating with the other crusaders in the march on Jerusalem, which was the original goal of the campaign. Disputes often arose among them, after they settled there, concerning the rule of a principality or who would take control of a city. To no avail, the papacy tried to intervene to resolve the disputes among princes or to warn them that the Muslims surrounded them and that their duty as crusaders was to cooperate in order to ward off danger from themselves. But these calls fell on deaf ears, because the aims of the princes were selfish and political. They were not greatly concerned about the approval or wrath of the Pope. In fact, some of the princes did not hesitate to make alliances with neighboring Muslim forces against their fellow crusaders, which indicates that the religious motives of those princes were often weak when they conflicted with their political motives. As for the Byzantine Emperor Alexius, he did not object to the aims of the campaign leaders, because if it were possible for the Byzantine state to regain the possessions that they had been lost as the result of Turkish raids, then he would have some Christian principalities on the border as a buffer zone, and Byzantium would have the right of sovereignty over them. In order to guarantee this, the emperor tried to extract an oath of loyalty from the Western princes. Thus the interests of both Christian sides in launching a war of aggression against the Muslim lands came together. And in fact, it is very difficult to separate the material factors from the spiritual ones which motivated the Christians to launch the Crusades. Poverty and the desire to accumulate wealth, along with the spirit of adventure, were factors which created a suitable atmosphere for war. But these factors only appeared as the result of what really provided the impetus for this holy war and liberation of this land, religious zeal. It is clear that the idea of war stemmed from papal policy, the policies of the Byzantine state, and the Islamo-Spanish wars. One of the factors which made it easy to declare war on the Islamic East was the regular fighting in which the Spanish and French engaged against the Muslims in Andalusia. This fighting had taken on the quality of holy war, both on the part of the Muslims, when the Almoravids in the Maghreb launched a religious jihad, and on the part of the Christians who were living in the atmosphere in which the Crusader campaigns against the East were launched. Even the great historian Ibn al-Athir adopted a comprehensive view of the external danger and regarded any aggression against any part of the Muslim world, whether in the East or in the West, as a small tributary of the same great river. It was organized foreign aggression against the greatest civilized power of the Middle Ages, namely the Islamic State. This is from one angle. From another angle, this historian clearly explains the reasons for the success of this three-pronged attack in Andalusia, Sicily, and Syria and Palestine, which was aimed at exploiting the divisions and attitudes of self-interest that affected the Muslim rulers of the time, for they had lost the spirit of initiative which distinguished the early rulers and Muslims who had built the Islamic State. It was clear to any observer that the Western Church was eager to expand its feudal lands and gain control of the Eastern churches, in addition to its desire to launch a war against the Muslims. One of the facts of religious fanaticism was the existence of religious groups that were directly connected to the Church and which were highly effective in those wars, such as the Knights Hospitalier, who were committed to defending Crusader possessions in the East and protecting the holy places. They had a direct connection with the Pope, and 1/10 of the income of the churches in Jerusalem was allocated to help them to fulfill their so-called religious mission. There were also the Knights Templar, who took as their headquarters part of the Temple of Solomon in Masjid al-Aqsa. The papacy and clergy had the power to influence, pressure and threaten anyone who did not carry out the wishes of the church by issuing a decree of excommunication, which implied that they would be denied blessing in the hereafter, as they claimed, and were not to be obeyed in this world either. Social motives. European society in the Middle Ages was governed by a distinct class system, dominated by the clergy and a warrior class composed of noblemen and knights. The peasant classes formed the majority, but were oppressed. They labored hard to meet the needs of the first two classes. The European peasant had no control of his destiny. He was required to fulfill many commitments to his feudal lord. The Pope was aware of the situation of the hard-working peasants, so he promised to annul their commitments to their masters and tempted them with the good things of the Islamic East. Thousands of peasants were living a life of misery under the feudal system. They built for themselves hovels of tree branches covered with roofs and mud and straw, with no windows or furniture. Anything that the peasant acquired was regarded as the private property of the feudal master, and he was deprived of any personal possessions. The peasants were weighed down with numerous commitments of service to their feudal masters, in addition to being deprived of whatever they produced. Thus we can see the extent of the misery in which most of the people of Europe were living in the 11th century Common Era. Hence, when the call for the Crusader campaign came, many in this population found an opportunity to free themselves from a harsh life filled with humiliation, and they took the danger of participating in this campaign very lightly, in comparison to the life they were living. If they died during this campaign, they would have salvation, and if they survived, they would have a life that was better than the way they had been living. The church knew how to play with their minds and instill grudges in their hearts against Islam and the Muslims. They tricked them into believing that they were going to liberate Jerusalem and the Holy Sepulchre, and that they would be blessed by the Lord and by the Pope. Hence there was nothing to deter them from slaughtering and killing. Killing a Muslim was something pleasant to God, for which the Crusader would be rewarded on the Day of Judgment. Economic motives. Avarice for the good things of the Islamic East was the strongest motive for the Crusades, after the religious motive. Pope Urban himself expressed in his sermon the importance of the economic motive with regard to the situation in Europe at that time. He said, "Do not let anything hold you back, because the land that you are residing in now, which is surrounded by sea and mountain tops, is too small for its many inhabitants. It is virtually unable to supply them with enough food, and because of that you are slaughtering and devouring one another. Jerusalem is a land without equal in its crops and produce. It is a veritable paradise of delights." Historical documents indicate that the economic situation in Western Europe at the end of the 11th century Common Era was very poor. France itself suffered a severe famine just before the First Crusade. Hence the ratio of French people who took part in it was far greater. The crisis was so severe that people resorted to eating grass and fodder. But this war opened a new door to those starving people, offering them the chance to escape from their difficult situation. This explains the many incidents of plunder and robbery perpetrated by the first campaign against the Christian people, whose lands they passed through. A large number of merchants from Italian, French, and Spanish cities also took part in the crusade for purely exploitative purposes, aiming to seize control of the trade routes for Eastern goods that were a source of great wealth for those who dealt in them. Hence their fleets played an active role in seizing the main centers in Syria. The Genoese helped the Franks seize Antioch in 490 Hijri, that is 1097 Common Era, and 2 years later, the Venetians helped the Romans seize Jerusalem. The first and last aim of these communities was profit and material gain. Their concern with the religious motive extended only so far as it would help them to achieve their aims. It is sufficient for us to note that the slogan of the Venetians, for which they were known at that time, was "Let us be Venetians first, then let us be Christians." Hence the Italian republics, Genoa, Pisa, and Venice, made contracts with the Crusader rulers in the East, which granted them important economic advantages. End of part 1 of chapter 2.